When you talk about an American woman who left a mark on history and made an impact on the financial well-being of generations well beyond her time, you will be referring to Sharlot M. Hall. To hear the story of Sharlot and her amazing life of accomplishments, we visit the Sharlot Hall Museum in Prescott, Arizona, founded by her in her name. An ever-growing and expanding museum to this day as a vital source of understanding and knowledge of America's arrival in Arizona through pictures, documents, artifacts, original structures, homes, and buildings, and reenactments of bygone days. The Sharlot Hall Museum celebrates events all year long, every year, portraying and displaying interactive programs, allowing people of today to step back in America's heritage and lifestyle.
Hi, I'm Fred Vail, Executive Director of the Sharlot Hall Museum, which is where we stand today. This museum was founded by a very remarkable lady named Sharlot M. Hall. The museum obviously is named after her. It encompasses 4 acres, 11 exhibit buildings, 5 or 6 of which are historic structures. The building behind me is the governor's mansion, and it was the home and office of the first 2 territorial governors who came here in 1864, approximately a year after the territory was founded in 1863. They came across the country, ended up in the Arizona Territory in this area in January of '64. Ultimately determined that this was the place to set up for business, so to speak. And the reason for that was gold. The governor's party, as it came across the country, was actually headed for Tucson. But when they reached Fort Wingate in New Mexico, they learned that gold had been discovered here in what we call the Central Highlands. So they changed direction and headed for what at the time they called the diggings, which led them to this area. Of course, miners and settlers were moving in because of the discovery of gold, and that set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the founding of Prescott on May 30, 1864. And maybe perhaps you'll get a chance to take a look at Fort Misery later today. That was the site. That cabin was the site of the public meeting that resulted in the founding of Prescott, and ultimately its determination by Governor Goodwin, who lived in this house, that Prescott would be the first territorial capital. When I mentioned the governor's party, that was of course led by Governor John Goodwin. He had with him officials that had been appointed by the president, who was Abraham Lincoln at the time, in 1863-64, which was in the midst of the Civil War. There was some promise of gold, and of course that came to fruition in several months later, when a party led by Joseph Rutherford Walker came in up the Hassayampa into the Central Highlands and made a discovery of gold. That was important to the east, where the war was being fought, because the war was expensive. Finding of gold would help support the war effort. Sharlot came here in 1882. She was 12 years old at the time. She had been born in Lincoln County, Nebraska, and came here with her family via wagon train, which is the way they traveled that day. Her father herded their horses that they had brought with them, and once they arrived here in the Central Highlands, he sold the horses to support them for a while. For quite a while, 8 years or so, he worked as a hydraulic miner in the mines. In 1890, they built Orchard Ranch, which is where Sharlot lived as a rancher for, well, until 1927, when she moved into the governor's mansion behind us. Sharlot, as a young girl, had very little education. She attended a one-room schoolhouse in what is now the Dewey area for a while. Came here to Prescott to attend high school for a year, and that was the extent of her formal schooling. But her dad didn't believe in education at all. He wanted her to work the ranch. Her mother, however, was very well read, and it inspired Sharlot to read a lot, and that's where she began to write poetry and so forth. During the period that she came to Prescott, where she attended school in Prescott, that's when she met Henry Fleury, and he inspired her to become interested in history. It was during that period of time that she traveled throughout the territory collecting artifacts and stories from pioneers that enabled her to begin the preservation of our history. And she was a person who was very dedicated to that purpose. She had a passion for that. And she did so in 1927 and opened the doors on June 11, 1928 to the first visitors. And that was the museum until the 1930s when it began to expand. She moved into the building actually in 1927, created a space in there for herself and began the renovations. During that period of time, thereafter, she was the curator, the director, the archivist, and the promoter through public relations, speaking, and so forth of the museum. In 1930s, she began to expand the museum through New Deal funding. The ranch house was constructed, representing a typical ranch house of the territory at the time. What we call the Stone Building, now known as the Sharlot Hall Building, was constructed with New Deal funding. She called that the House of 1,000 Hands. And the reason for that is she estimated that 500 workers at one time worked on that building in order to earn a paycheck that they used to support their families. It was, of course, during the Great Depression. That building was completed roughly in the mid-1930s. She also arranged to have an old log building, or then known as Fort Misery as well, to the museum and have it reassembled. It dated back to 1864. That building, Fort Misery, was the building at which the first town meeting was held that resulted in the founding of Prescott in 1864. Sharlot continued as operating the museum throughout the rest of her life, which ended in 1943. She had a heart attack, moved into the Pioneers' Home, and died shortly thereafter. She had determined there would be no funeral, no service following her death, which her friends ultimately ignored, and had a major funeral service here on the museum grounds. The speaker, or one of the eulogies, was delivered by the governor of Arizona, Sidney Osborne, to suggest to you that the esteem in which she had been held. Since her death, the museum has expanded greatly. With her vision, it would be on these grounds that there would be a museum that would develop, that would be representative of her vision of the territory. Sharlot was a woman well ahead of her time. She was a poet, an activist, a historian, a rancher, and just a woman who made her mark not just in Prescott, but across the state of Arizona.
Here now are a few of the items and pictures that are on display at the museum. Watch.
So she was about 30 years old when she wore this dress. We actually have some photographs of her in it, which is the best kind of provenance you can have. Yeah, she probably purchased this out when she was going to LA, and so she probably just needed a nice outfit. I actually think I like it better without the jacket because the sleeves are just so amazing.
The museum has another exceptional dress, a one-of-a-kind, designed and made for Sharlot for a special occasion. Sharlot was chosen to be the person to cast Arizona's electoral vote for Calvin Coolidge as president, and she wore a dress designed and made of heavy copper to make a statement for Arizona. To top it off, she added a specially designed prickly pear hat. Both are on display at the museum.
Hello, I'm Mick Woodcock, Chief Curator here at the Sharlot Hall Museum. We're in our Sharlot Hall exhibit in the Lawler Center, and we have just a few of the many images of Sharlot and her family. This particular one shows Sharlot in the dress that we looked at that Kylan has. And then we have various images of her as a ranch woman, which she very much was, as a historian, as a poet, and even as a politician. And in this case, we have artifacts that we know belong to her and her family. This is probably our favorite photograph of Sharlot because it was taken inside the governor's mansion. We still have this chair, many of these objects in our collections, and of course, this ledger is in our archival holdings. So this is just a great shot. It looks to me like she's wearing the shoes that she wore with the copper dress, which are copper colored, but they're not actually made out of copper. But she's wearing her Pioneer Reunion medal. She's obviously dressed for this photograph, so really an important thing to us, and particularly in the collections, to have all of these objects. So here we have a photograph taken in front of the governor's mansion, and of course Sharlot's in the center, but this is Fiorello LaGuardia, who at the time this was taken was mayor of New York City. Fiorello had grown up at Fort Whipple. His father was the bandmaster, and he actually graduated from school here, and he always considered Prescott home because he had lived here the longest. One thing I should say, though, that we're take up an entire city block, so you need to allow plenty of time to visit the exhibits and the outdoor buildings. Our grounds are beautiful all year round, and so we are an outdoor museum. We have historic homes here from the 1860s, 1870s, right on up, buildings as new as our education center.
Hometowns and Heroes takes this opportunity to salute Sharlot Hall's sense of vision in preserving so much of early Arizona history. She is well worthy of being our hometown hero.
Join us again next time to hear another inspiring story featuring our next hometown hero. If you have a hero in your hometown, let us give them a hand.